Today I'm going to be doing a little bit of forge welding, and I'm going to be demonstrating one of my favorite welds, and it's called the cleft weld. Hi, I'm Dennis Frechette, and welcome back. Today I'm going to be demonstrating one of my favorite welds, and it's called the cleft weld. You don't see it used very much, and I don't really understand why. It is a little fussy to get set up, so that may be the reason. But once you work through those problems, and all of those problems, by the way, are things that you deal with before you put the piece in the fire. So, if you have an extra set of hands to help you get this all set up or, whatever, that'll help a lot. But once you get it in the fire, it takes care of itself because you're putting the forge weld in the fire as a unit and you're taking it out as a unit. And in fact, the weld actually sets in the fire because everything is together, and when the two pieces get the forge welding temperature, they just automatically stick together. They're not fully welded, but they're tacked enough that you can pull the thing out as a unit, take it over to the anvil, and finish the weld. So as far as a beginner weld goes, it's probably one of the best because once you put it in the fire, like I said, it takes care of itself. So that's what I have for you today. Hopefully it'll answer some of the questions you may have about this weld or some of the concerns that you have about, how complicated it is or whatever. But I hope this will show you that it's has a lot of advantages and it's a really good weld, and that's why it's one of my favorites, and I use it whenever I can. Here on the anvil is an example of one of the most common applications for forge welding in the blacksmith shop. I need a bar that's heavy at one end and long and skinny at the other end. And I just happen to have two bars that are roughly the dimensions that I need. So if I can join these two pieces together, it's going to save me a heck of a lot of hammering. Now, the most common way to do that is to set the two bars on top of each other and forge weld them together with a lap weld. Today I'm going to be welding these two pieces together with a cleft weld. When you're doing a lap weld, you're stacking the two bars together and then you're welding the outside face of one bar to the outside face of the other bar. When you're doing a cleft weld, you need to split open one of the bars so that you can insert the other bar into that opening. So you wind up welding the inside faces of one bar to the outside faces of the other bar. The first step in the process, which is common for just about every forge weld, is to upset the end of the small bar. And that gives me a little bit more material to work with while I'm setting the weld. The big mistake that people make when they're trying to upset a small bar like this is to use too heavy a hammer. This hammer has too much driving force and it's just driving the bar back. It isn't really upsetting the end. Now that I switched to a lighter hammer, the bar is now heavy enough to support the work that I'm doing on the end. Also, the lighter hammer doesn't have the driving force to push the bar out of the way or to distort the bar, so all of the energy provided is staying at the end of the bar and it is being used to push the bar back onto itself. So even though it's counterintuitive, when you're upsetting, you quite often get a lot more work done with a lighter hammer than you would if you were using a much heavier hammer. You're also getting a lot more work done because you're not spending as much time correcting all of the distortion that's created from a heavier hammer. The last thing I need to do to this small bar is to forge a very short taper on the end of the bar. The larger bar is going to be split and wrapped around this smaller bar, so I need that taper to make a really smooth transition between the two sections of the bar that are going to be going on either side of this taper. Now I can start getting the larger bar ready for the weld. Here I don't have to upset anything because I'm starting with more material than I need. So I'm going to bring the width of the bar down to the width of the smaller bar, and I'm going to draw the other side to be a little bit thicker, and that's where I'm going to get my extra material that I need for the weld. Here I use my bandsaw to create the saw cut that I'm going to use for the opening. I obviously had it on a bit of an angle because it isn't too straight, but fortunately that doesn't matter too much. Here you can see first of all how I totally forgot to move the camera during this, but what I'm trying to do is figure out a solution if you don't have a vise for getting these two pieces to fit together perfectly. So the small bar is cold and I'm using it as a fuller to drive into the larger bar. I started by trying to drive it into the side of the anvil. Here I'm trying to drive it in on the face of the anvil. Neither one of them worked all that well. So this is one of those situations where if you have somebody handy, you could hold it upright on the face of the anvil, or they can, and then you could use a fuller or the bar itself to drive into the hot section of the hot bar and create a good fit that way. Here I'm a little bit further along. I've reheated everything. I've cleaned off the scale while it was red hot, and I applied flux, and now I'm getting ready to actually do the weld. The nice thing about this weld is when you get the two pieces fit together, you can hammer them together, and there's enough spring action in the V-notch of the larger bar to clamp everything together while it's cold. So that makes it a lot easier to get it into the fire. The condition of the fire is the most important part of any forged weld. If you don't have the right atmosphere in the fire, or if you don't have enough of a fire underneath your work, you just won't be able to get the quality of heat that you need to get a good forged weld. So if you don't have that, you're really wasting your time. With this weld, it's even more important because you have to lay the pieces in there very carefully, and you can't touch them until they start to tack up and weld on their own. So you need a good solid fire. You have to take the time to rake through, make sure you have all the clinkers out of it, make sure you have enough coke in the middle of the fire, and you have a good solid fire, because you can't touch this fire until you're ready to pull the pieces out. So everything has to be right. If you're new to blacksmithing and forge welding in particular, and you're still a little leery about trying it, I'll have some links in the description of other videos that I've made that either deal exclusively with forge welding, or they're projects where I've talked at length about the forge welding process or the fire management. Now that I have the fire ready, I'm going to lay the bar into the fire exactly where I want it. I'm using an extra pair of tongs to hold on to the larger end of the bar so that I can apply pressure and make sure that it doesn't shift out of position. Now I'm going to carefully rake the coke that I have on the edges of the fire over top of the bar, and then I'm going to slowly bring the whole thing up to a welding heat. I'm going to do one last check of the fire to make sure that I haven't missed anything, because don't forget, the bars are being held together right now because they're still relatively cold, and the clamping pressure that I had at the anvil is still in effect. Once they start heating up, I'm going to lose that. So I have to have enough time in this fire to get me to a point where the bars start tacking up and they want to stay together on their own. If I start poking around in the fire before that, the two bars can shift out of position, and I'm going to have to pull them out, realign them, and put them back in, basically starting from scratch. So that's really going to slow me down. So it really pays to make sure you have a good fire and leave it alone until you get up to a welding temperature. So at this point, I've set the bars into an extremely hot fire, and I'm going to take advantage of the bars still being cold to really give this fire a lot more air. I want to ramp up the intensity of this fire as much as I can while I can. And then as soon as the bars start to take on some color, I'm going to really throttle back on the amount of air that I give that fire. So there's going to be a big blazing fire, and it's going to be looking for every little bit of oxygen that it can get. So it's going to generate a lot of heat, take any oxygen that it can from the metal. So that's going to create that reducing atmosphere that you need to get a good weld. And it also is going to take very little air to maintain that intense heat. And that's what you want. You want to have a super hot fire that takes very little air to maintain. And for that, you need densely packed coke in the center of the fire, and you need to take the time to build that fire up into a big mass of heat. Every bit of it has to be hot when you put those bars in. And then you basically just sit around and wait for the heat of the fire to be absorbed into the steel. So you'll be able to tell from the way I'm cranking. I'll give it a little bit of air. I'll let it sit for a bit, give it a little bit more air. I'm just giving it enough to maintain the fire, and I'm just waiting for the color of the fire to turn into the color of the steel. And then when I think I'm ready, I'm going to wait a little bit longer, and then I'll pull it out. So the bars have been at welding heat for a couple of minutes now, and very shortly you're going to hear some sharp tapping noises, and that's me hitting the end of the bar with a hammer and driving the small bar into the large bar right in the fire. And that's one of the things that I really like about this type of forge welding. You don't even have to take it out of the fire to start setting the welds. So that's it. They're really well tacked together. Everything's moving as a unit, and if all went well, it would probably take quite a bit of effort to pull these bars apart, even at this stage. Here I'm getting ready to do some very light hammering just to set the welds. They did tack up in the fire, and they were working in the fire as a unit. I just used a pair of tongs as an added insurance to make sure that something didn't slip out of position as I was bringing it over to the anvil. Now I'm going to apply more flux, put it back in the fire, and then just repeat the process as many times as I feel is necessary. A lot of people feel that I use a lot of flux, and I'm really not. What I'm using is 20 mule team borax, and it's right out of the box. So at this point, the borax is mostly water, so the white buildup that you're seeing really isn't flux. It's all of the water that's boiling away from the borax. What you're left with is a very shiny, thin, varnishy, looking film on the bar. That's the active ingredients of the borax that's actually protecting the weld, and that really isn't that thick. Here I'm trying to do a little bit of cosmetic surgery. I noticed a little gap in between the two pieces, so I'm trying to upset the bars to see if I can get rid of that gap. I'm actually half hoping that I could split the welds open so I could reposition the whole thing, but obviously they took pretty well. That didn't happen, so I'll have another go at it here in a minute. So here's the little gap that I missed earlier. You can see that little round hole right at the very tip of the small part. It's very easy to do. This, gets filled up with flux or scale or whatever, and try to avoid it as much as possible, but it does happen. The mistake I made was trying to experiment with using the actual bar as a fuller to create the opening in the larger bar. Normally I would take a fuller, create a opening that's a little bit larger, and then I would hammer the opening back down onto the smaller bar. So that's what I'm going to do next time, and hopefully you'll see the difference. So it's a few minutes later, and here's what it looks like when I do it the way I normally do it. You can see how the smaller piece fits right into the opening, right down to the base. Now I'll be taking these apart, applying flux, putting it back together, and then hammering the two edges back down to clamp onto the bar so I can insert it in the fire the way I did earlier. So once again, this is another one of those processes where you only run into problems if you create them for yourself. So here you can see the original weld on the left, and there's an obvious gap, at the tip of the small bar. The one on the right is the one I just finished, and the only difference is that I took an extra 3 or 4 minutes in the setup to make sure that I had the fit exactly right. I rushed through the first one, I didn't rush through the second one, and here you see the results. On the brighter side, the weld that I screwed up does illustrate how well established the welds were when they were still in the fire. When I was trying to set the welds in the fire by hammering the end of the bar, they were already set. That's why I couldn't move the smaller bar into the base of that groove. It just stayed where it was. To get those bars to move, I should have tried setting the welds 2 or 3 minutes earlier than I actually did. And that's something I never realized before.